In Unit 3, we examined the origins of this law conception of ethics by looking at the kind of paradigmatic proponent of the natural law approach, St. Thomas Aquinas. What we're going to look at in Unit 4 is how those ideas, this law conception of ethics, are taken up by certain thinkers and how it lends itself to, or how it ultimately kind of gets transformed into some of the modern language that we use, modern language such as rights. And so we're going to now look at the origin of some kind of distinctly modern moral terminology and conceptions. So if you recall the abortion debate, which seems like a long time ago now, a lot of people appealed to rights. Neither Aquinas nor Aristotle say anything about rights. And what we're going to see from Locke and Kant, they don't really talk about rights that much. You find the word, but their ideas really give the foundation for theories of rights. And if you recall, we also looked at, we saw Peter Singer saying all this kind of stuff about preferences and so on. He's a utilitarian. We're going to examine utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is in certain ways a response, a kind of criticism of, or rises as a kind of criticism of this modern rights law-based approach to ethics. So we're going to see how that works too. Now, before we jump into the details of Locke's ideas, I want to do two things in this video. First, we're going to talk about some of the history that happens in between Aquinas and Locke, and then I'll say something very brief about Locke himself, who he was, when he lived, that kind of thing. Very brief biography. So we have Aquinas, who we've read now, back in the 1200s, and now we're going to be reading this guy Locke. John Locke, who wrote in the 1600s, died in the early 1700s. And so you see there's a bit of time there, right? And one of the things we're going to want to do is understand what happened and what some of the big changes were there that happened in between Aquinas and Locke. But to understand the import of those changes, I want to describe kind of very quickly the reigning intellectual paradigm during Aquinas' day. So Aquinas ends up being hugely influential on all thought, on any intellectual endeavors, just as Aristotle was. And the view of the world that Aquinas and Aristotle kind of articulated and that became the reigning intellectual paradigm was people will now call a teleological view of the world. Aquinas and Aristotle had a teleological view of the world. Teleological, that's a made-up word. It's not a real word. Teleology, it comes from the Greek word for telos. Aristotle uses that word. The Greek word telos means something like goal, or end, or purpose. And so a teleological conception of the world is going to be a conception of the world in which you think, or in which there are purposes and goals out in the world, right? Things out in the world have certain purposes, and that's why they act or react or behave in the way that they do. And so the idea would be something like this. Why do we already saw this in Aristotle when we looked at the function argument? Why, if you wanted to ask the question, why is the heart of this particular shape, or why does it have a valve there? A teleological answer to that question, a teleological explanation to that question, why does the heart have this valve right here, would be to cite the purpose of the heart, right? That would be a teleological explanation. The heart has this little valve here so that it can pump blood. That's its purpose. That's its end. That's its goal. That's why that valve is there. And that might seem rather innocuous when it comes to the case of a heart. But Aquinas and Aristotle wanted to apply this much more broadly. So we've seen how they apply it to the case of human beings and human life. Human beings have a purpose, a goal, an end. They have, and to put it in Aristotle's words, a function, right? And their goal or end, or whatever you want to call it, their purpose is to perform that function well. All biological things work like that. They all have purposes. They all have goals. Ducks have purposes or goals. It's to live a duck life. Human beings have purposes or goals, to live the human life, right? Something like that. Though that's a teleological view. And again, you might think, I don't know, that seems okay. What Aquinas and Aristotle did, and this was the reigning intellectual paradigm up until the 1500s or so, and we're going to talk about it in just a second. They tried to explain inanimate natural phenomenon in this way too. They didn't know about gravity. That was not an idea. That didn't come until the 1700s with Newton. And so what they thought, people like Aquinas and Aristotle thought, they thought all kind of material reality was formed out of certain elements. You might think, well, yeah, that's kind of what we think too. We got that periodic table of elements. Well, they obviously didn't know about lithium and carbon and magnesium and so on. They thought there were 4 basic elements: earth, fire, air, and water. And everything that we, so your bone, your flesh and everything, it's just a certain proportion of those 4 elements mixed together. Same with a piece of wood, same with whatever, right? Anything else you have out there that's made out of material. They thought those 4 basic elements had a goal or an end or a purpose. Take earth. What is the goal or end or purpose or function of earth? Well, what does it do characteristically? It doesn't necessarily grow things. They're not going to say growth. That's just what it does for other things. What does it do on its own? What is its own internal purpose, right? It can't be growing things. That's what it does for other things. What does it do on its own? And what they thought is, well, look, if we pick up some earth and then move your hand, the earth goes down. More specifically, what does it do? It goes below the air. And then if you were to have that earth over like a bucket of water or something and drop it, it'd go first below the air, then it would like hit the water, and then it'd go below the water. Earth's function is to be below the other elements. It's to be below water and air and fire. And look, if you were to light a fire, what does the fire do? It goes up, right? It tries to get up above the air. And so fire's function is to be up above the air. It's looking for what they called its natural place. The 4 elements always seek out their natural place. And then water's natural place is above the earth, but below the air. Air's natural place is above the water, but below the fire. Okay, fine. That's the idea. So they had this teleological view of the world, and that's what they all thought was true. Well, and this thing that I've been talking about, how earth, water, air, fire have these natural places. This was called the doctrine of natural place, and it was seen as a straightforward implication of a teleological view of the world. Okay, why am I mentioning all this? Well, because this doctrine of natural place had a rather straightforward implication of its own, namely that the earth was at the center of the universe. And the reason we all stick to it is because we got a lot of earth in us. We're like mostly earth. And so we're trying to and that's why when you jump up, you immediately come back down below the air or whatever, right? The earth that makes you up is seeking its natural place. And the natural place for all earth is boom, right at the center of the universe, below everything else. Well, that naturally lends itself then. Well, what does that mean? That earth at the center of the universe? That means geocentrism, right? Everything else revolves around the earth. The earth is at the center of the universe, at the center of the solar system, and all the stars and planets and the sun and everything revolve around the earth. That was the going idea of the time. That's what Aristotle thought. That's what Aquinas thought. That's what every kind of respectable scientist thought. Okay, so I mention all that because that forms the necessary background for what we're going to see, for what some of the changes are. More generally, Aristotle looms large. We've seen Aquinas is an Aristotelian. Aristotle is huge. Aristotle is what everybody turns to. Now, two major events happen in between Aquinas and Locke. We get the beginnings of a kind of, I don't know what you want to call it. I don't mean to say anything, but a kind of revolution within religion. So Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church at Wittenberg in 1517, which kickstarts the Protestant Reformation. England passes the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which establishes the Anglican Church as separate from the Pope, basically. Claims that the English monarch is the head of the church in England, and so establishes the Anglican Church. Right. So throughout the 1500s, and people, it's hard to put an end date on the Reformation, and scholars disagree about this, but they put it, it goes into the 1630s or 40s. I think a lot of people put it at the Treaty of Westphalia, but which is in the mid 17th century. Doesn't really matter, right? It's kind of going on, 1500s, Protestant Reformation. Okay, well, that obviously has implications for a kind of Thomistic view of things. More specifically, what we're in position to know now, the Protestant Reformation, if you read Luther, if you look at Martin Luther's collected works, and you search it for Aristotle, just about everything you find is going to be, he didn't write that much about him, but when he did, he hated Aristotle. And more generally, the Protestant reformers thought this Aristotelian philosophical take on religion was misguided in the extreme. And so the Protestant Reformation was in many ways rebuking, a distancing from Aristotle, a rebuking of Aristotle. We don't want Aristotle infecting Christianity. And so the Protestant reformers, by and large, tended to be very critical and dismissive of Aristotle, and so very critical and dismissive of the kind of reigning intellectual paradigm of the day. Yeah, that's the first major event that happens, or a series of events. But there are other things going on too. And indeed, the 16th century is a century of incredible change, monumental change, one of the most monumental centuries that humans have lived through. Because alongside the Protestant Reformation, we have scientists doing their work, doing their revolutionary work. And so Nicholas Copernicus publishes On the Revolutions. He never publishes in his lifetime. It's published fairly shortly after he dies. He dies in 1543. But that's where Copernicus argues for a heliocentric view of the universe, right? So in contrast to the reigning intellectual paradigm, which is geocentric, which put the Earth at the center of the universe, Copernicus argues that the sun is at the center, right? And that the Earth revolves around the sun. Kepler, refining certain observations made by Tycho Brahe in the 16th century, tries to formalize, make a little bit more precise the heliocentric model. And then Galileo, of course, kind of comes along in the early 1600s. Oh, I got the date on that wrong. Galileo wrote the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1632, not 1609. Doesn't really matter though. And so alongside the Protestant Reformation, happening at the same time, is the scientific revolution. And what we're in position to see now, having understood Aristotle and a bit Aquinas, and having talked a little bit about teleology, you might just think, oh, the scientific revolution, that's like, I don't know, people started doing science or whatever. Well, that's not quite right. People were doing science forever prior to then. What was really noteworthy about the scientific revolution was its rejection of teleology. And that's indeed how Galileo and other proponents of the scientific revolution saw themselves. They saw themselves as overturning the reigning intellectual paradigm. Because look, they had argued, teleology, a teleological view of the world, this Thomistic Aristotelian view of the world, fairly straightforwardly implies that the Earth is at the center of the universe. But Galileo makes his telescopes look up, that's not how it works. The Earth is not at the center. And so geocentrism is false. But geocentrism is implied by this doctrine of natural place. Well, so that doctrine of natural place is false. But that doctrine of natural place is implied by this Thomistic Aristotelian teleological view of the world. Well, that view of the world must be wrong. Thomas and Aristotle, wrong. Teleological explanations, trying to explain things by talking about their purposes, misguided and wrong. Don't do it. That's unscientific, right? That becomes how the proponents of the scientific revolution think. So a very clear case of this would be a fellow you may have heard of in your science classes in high school, Francis Bacon. He's credited as an originator of the scientific method and so on. He explicitly attacks Aristotle and explicitly attacks teleology. Teleology got in the way of doing true, real science. That was kind of the idea. And so we need to reject teleological explanations, right? And so there are these monumental shifts in intellectual culture, right? This monumental rebuking of an Aristotelian view of the world, a teleological view of the world. That's the major event that kind of happens in between Aquinas and Locke. Locke himself, born in England, he was his parents were Puritans. He was his own religious beliefs. It's kind of hard to pin down exactly what he thought. He seemed to have kind of unique religious beliefs. He a Christian or something of some stripe, Protestant of some stripe, right? Locke. And Locke was friends with a bunch of these kind of later, not friends with Copernicus, obviously, they didn't overlap at all, but he was friends with a lot of scientists like Newton. He was friends with Newton. He was friends with the other guy, Boyle. Boyle's seen as the founder of modern chemistry. Locke knew these people. He's very much influenced by them. Locke disliked Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy. Sometimes that's called scholastic philosophy, this kind of Thomistic Aristotelian philosophy. Locke was very critical. He had nothing. That was garbage, right? He was much more interested in the new science and so on, right? So that's going to give us some a framework for thinking about the changes that Locke is going to make, or differences that we see between Locke and Aquinas. And we're going to talk about those as we proceed. Now, a very quick biographical sketch of Locke. He's born in 1632 and dies in 1704. Right, 17th century guy. So so Galileo publishes his work that he gets in trouble for in 1632. And so when Locke is of age and learning and so on, Galileo is well known. The new science is well known, and Locke's kind of taken with the new science. He was born in a town outside Bristol in England. He's an English guy, and he went to study at Oxford University. His father was a lawyer, so Locke came from a kind of middle class family, so he wasn't independently wealthy or anything like that. He goes to study at Oxford University. He's a very good student, and there he meets Lord Ashley, is what they call him. He was the Earl of Shaftesbury. He was some bigwig aristocratic fella. Probably actually wore a big wig, now that I think about it. And a thing that people like that would do is they would have personal, they'd have a retinue. And Locke becomes part of the Earl of Shaftesbury's retinue. And in particular, he becomes his physician. Locke studies medicine and becomes a physician. His interests are not limited to medicine. He writes on a wide variety of topics. He's interested in science. He's interested primarily in philosophy. He's interested in political philosophy. And this is thought to be in large part because of the Earl of Shaftesbury. The Earl of Shaftesbury was involved in political happenings and goings-ons and whatever. Two most important works that Locke wrote, the two treatises of government. That work ends up being hugely influential on the founding fathers of the United States. The ideas that they had, the ideas that you can find in the founding documents, right? Huge influence. Locke had a huge influence on those. We're not really going to look at that in a whole lot of detail because it's not really what our purposes are. We're reading some things from the Two Treatises of Government, but then the other major work he wrote, so Two Treatises of Government is work in political philosophy. He also wrote this long book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is mostly about metaphysics and epistemology. We're going to be reading from this work. What we're reading is the occasional kind of tangential remark that he makes about ethics and morality. He does not write that much about it. We're reading most of the remarks he has, which is not very many. But we're going to see what he thinks about ethics and morality and how that relates to Aquinas. That's one of the things we're going to be paying attention to. Given these changes in the kind of intellectual climate, what does that necessitate for how we think about ethics? That's what we're going to start trying to think through with Locke.